Hi, welcome to our second week of Dear Politicians, where we discuss eco-poetry, environmental crisis, and how arts can help, with the fight for climate justice. Last week, we went through an introduction to eco-poetry with Andrew Macmillan and Hannah Grist. So if you missed that, you can watch it. I will put the link in the chat for the website. And in today's session, we will discuss poetry and activism and how art can help fuel action and how conservation organizations work with artists. We have two incredible speakers today for you, Ian McLachlan and Katherine Gammel. And I think we'll start with Ian. He is a founding member of Poets for the Planet and member of Extinction Rebellion Hackney and a writer. And he will today talk about the work People for the Planet and Extinction Rebellion Hackney have done, as well as discuss how poetry ties to environmental activism. So without further ado, Ian, if you want to start.
Hello, everybody. I'm just going to share my screen. Okay. So yeah, thank you for attending this talk on eco-poetry and the movement. I'm Ian McLachlan. I'm a founding member of Poets for the Planet and a member of Extinction Rebellion Hackney. I've been writing poetry for 20 years and eco-poetry for the last 5 years, and I've been a climate activist since 2018. I think most people know we treat the world badly, but many tend to look away. I've always tried not to look away. I've been a long-standing supporter of the World Wildlife Fund. I don't eat meat. I predominantly travel by walking or taking public transport. But over the last few years, the scale of the environmental crisis and the apparent incapacity of our governments and systems to deal with it has made me feel this isn't enough. And I guess that's what has pushed me into activism and the attempt to put my craft as a writer at the service of the planet. In today's talk, I'm going to look at why there's a need for environmental activism and what poetry can do to support it. I'll summarize the work I've done with XR and Poets for the Planet and say something about how eco-poets might reach a wider audience. So why is activism necessary? I think the root of our problem is overconsumption. By the end of 2021, we had used 1.7 Earths. We are massively over-consuming the world's resources. We are a global super predator that is devouring our own planet. In the process of doing that, we've generated a lethal combination of environmental crises. So there's the climate crisis, which consists of the increasing strength and frequency of floods, droughts, hurricanes, and tornadoes, sea level rise, and ocean acidification. The Royal Society has said these impacts are expected to increase with greater warming and will threaten food production, freshwater supplies, coastal infrastructure, and especially the welfare of the huge population currently living in low-lying areas. Simultaneously, there is a pollution crisis. Almost a fifth of premature deaths globally are caused by air pollution. By 2050, there will be more plastic by weight in the ocean than fish. And there is also the 6th mass extinction. The previous 5 mass extinctions are thought to have resulted from changes in the Earth's temperature and climate. This 6th mass extinction is an ongoing extinction event of species as a result of human activity. With this, it's worth bearing in mind that species are links in ecosystems, and as they disappear, the species they interact with are likely to disappear as well. If you break enough links in the chain, the whole system collapses. So that's the problem. What can poetry do about it? Well, not much, according to W.H. Auden. In his poem, In Memory of W.B. Yeats, he says that poetry makes nothing happen. For Auden, poetry is a mouth. It recounts things, but it doesn't change things. A contradictory view of poetry is offered by Percy Bysshe Shelley. For Shelley, poetry can make new rules for us to live by. It can change attitudes, it can change minds. Perhaps unsurprisingly, I agree with Shelley. I think the poet can be an active change maker rather than simply a passive commentator. How poetry, and specifically eco-poetry, can help to bring about change is something I'll look at. But first, it might be worth considering what eco-poetry is. So I would define eco-poetry as poetry written to raise an awareness of the environmental threat, either by awakening us to the preciousness and precariousness of nature, or by giving nature a human voice to speak up for itself, or by holding up a mirror to our own destructive behavior. So what can eco-poets do to help protect the environment? They can join a movement like Extinction Rebellion and protest. XR encourages artists to perform at events and programs them into their main actions. In such cases, I guess poetry has two audiences: protest group members, for whom the poetry can be morale raising, and the general public, for whom it can be awareness raising. And on screen are a couple of protests that I've attended. Performing eco-poetry on the street as part of a protest movement isn't without obstacles, though, particularly if the protest movement like XR is centered on civil disobedience. During the international uprising in October 2019, the police closed many of the protest sites before poets could perform at them. At this point, it's worth mentioning the Police Crime Sentencing and Courts Bill currently going through Parliament, which threatens to limit our right to protest, and in so doing, to further subdue the voice of the eco-poet on the streets. As well as helping raise morale and increase public awareness of environmental issues, poetry can also be an entertainment delivered to help with fundraising. So XR Tower Hamlets organised a couple of fundraisers which featured poetry, the first in East London, and the second event was forced online in the early days of the pandemic, and the money raised was donated to Bow and Bromley Food Bank. As well as joining protest movements like XR, poets can create their own movements. Poets for the Planet is an example of this. It's a group of poets, performers, artists, and creative activists coming together in response to the climate crisis. Poets for the Planet was started by Jacqueline Safra in 2019. Jacqueline said, "Poetry can help us really look at the almost unbearable reality of climate change, and once we can look, it becomes possible to act." Jacqueline put out a call on Facebook, and Poets for the Planet held our first meeting at the Poetry Society in Covent Garden. The group decided to run a poetry event consisting of performances and workshops at the Society of Authors, which, inspired by the 1980s Live Aid concert, we called Verse Aid. Verse Aid's purpose was to raise awareness of climate change and to raise funds for environmental charities. I suspect it was more successful at the latter than the former. So Verse Aid raised around £6,800 for Earthwatch and Bees for Development, and in so doing, it demonstrated that poetry can generate income for environmental action. In terms of awareness, I think the event raised the profile of the climate crisis in the UK poetry community, but I'm not sure how effective it was at reaching a wider audience, largely because though we circulated a press release, the event didn't really attract any media attention. And if you're up for watching 7 straight hours of poetry, you can see the poemathon we ran at Verse Aid on the Society of Authors YouTube channel. The month following Verse Aid, we were hit by the pandemic. The question then became, what could eco-poets do to reach an audience with their work given the new lockdown restrictions? We decided to run a digital campaign on Twitter called Begin Afresh. The advantage of this kind of campaign is potentially you can reach anyone in the world with access to social media. The title of the campaign came from the last stanza of Philip Larkin's poem, The Trees. Yet still the unresting castles thresh in full-grown thickness every May. Last year is dead, they seem to say. Begin afresh, afresh, afresh. Philip Larkin was a relatively early eco-poet with poems like Going, Going, published in 1972, which specifically challenged the environmental destructiveness of modern capitalism. His ecopoetics are also demonstrated in his very sensitive, almost reverential use of language when describing nature, which is evident in poems like The Trees. You find a similar sensibility in earlier British poets like William Wordsworth and John Clare. Both those poets were born in the 18th century, which saw the emergence of the Industrial Revolution and the creation of the pathway which has led us to our current climate crisis. In that context, another 18th century poet, William Blake's phrase, "dark satanic mills," might seem especially apposite now. For our Begin Afresh campaign, poets were invited to upload filmed eco-poets poems to Twitter, along with the hashtag Begin Afresh. We opened the campaign with contributions from Poets for the Planet's patrons. So Poet Laureate Simon Armitage contributed his poem, Last Snowman. As you can see, Simon thermally imaged himself in the video. He said he thought the thermal imaging appropriate to the poem, and he also said he was sick of the sight of his normal lockdown self. Hopefully we should be able to listen to that poem.
Last Snowman. He drifted south down an Arctic seaway on a plinth of ice, jelly tots weeping lime green tears around both eyes, a carrot for a nose, some reported parsnip, below which a clay pipe drooped from a mouth that was pure stroke victim. A red woolen scarf trailed in the meltwater drool at his base, and he slumped to starboard, kinked, gone at the pelvis. From the buffet deck of a passing cruise liner, stag and hen parties shied Scotch eggs and pink ladies as he rounded the stern. He sailed on between banks of rubberneckers and camera lenses into a bloodshot west, past islands vigorous with sunflower and bog myrtle, singular and abominable.
Ian McLachlan is another of Poets for the Planet's patrons, and he contributed his poem, Uncle Charlie's Best Flat Cap.
Here's a poem that on one level is about my Uncle Charlie's flat cap, but on another level is about the world. And he had one good flat cap, and we got one good world. It's called Uncle Charlie's Best Flat Cap. He wore it when he sat in the garden, and it fitted him perfectly. "You only need one cap, lad," he said, "if it's a good one." He breathed as deeply as he could with those pit-shafted lungs and said, "That air, it's like wine, you know." But I just typed that as, "That air, it's like wire, you know." And then the cap didn't fit. The one cap he had didn't fit anymore, and the air like wire and the heat, and suddenly he's coughing like an out-of-tune brass section, and the cap is tightening. The one cap, air like barbed wire, air like barbed wire.
A few stats to show how the campaign did. At the same time as we were running Begin Afresh, Black Lives Matter protests were exploding globally in response to the murder of George Floyd, and environmental movements were becoming increasingly focused on the idea of climate justice. So, for example, Extinction Rebellion groups, in addition to the original 3XR demands, Tell the Truth About Climate Change, Act Now, and Form a Citizens' Assembly, were creating a fourth demand. XR Tower Hamlet's fourth demand states, the government must implement a just transition to an ecologically balanced society, prioritizing the needs and voices of the most vulnerable and redressing the past and present global inequalities caused by centuries of colonial, gender, and class exploitation, while upholding all species' rights to life. Poets for the Planet responded by starting a virtual eco-poetry open mic night called Fresh to highlight the poetry of underrepresented groups. And we also sought to give a voice to poets from underrepresented groups and from countries most threatened by climate change when we put in a bid to perform at COP26, the United Nations Climate Change Conference in Glasgow. Our show, Earth Song, consisted of 19 poets from 5 continents performing in 12 different languages, which included isiZulu, Hindi, and Brazilian Portuguese. We wanted the poems featured in Earth Song to connect strongly to the science. This was partly driven by one of Earth Song's organisers, Dr. Robin Lamble, who is both a climate scientist and a poet, and it was also a response to the British scientist and novelist C.P. Snow, who in his 1959 Reed lecture famously claimed that science and the humanities had become split into 2 cultures, and that this division was a major setback to both in solving the world's problems. We were very clear that science and the humanities must work together to address the environmental crisis. How do you get climate science into poetry? Well, we organised a series of online workshops at which environmental scientists briefed our Earth Song poets about their research. And we were very privileged to receive support from some very distinguished scientists. So, for example, Yuri Rogel is a member of the board, which informs and advises the European Union on its climate action. A couple of thoughts from the scientists. So Yuri Rogel says art can help make people connect, understand other perspectives, and imagine new futures. All these aspects are crucial in our fight against climate change. And Dr. Tilly Collins said, through art and partnerships with artists, we can become more effective communicators to inspire action. What about our poets? Sindiswa Zulu from South Africa said, climate change, air pollution, environmental racism are not just topics we should leave to scientists. We are all affected, and it is a fight we should write and verbalize at all costs. At this point, it's worth stressing that many of the countries on the front line of climate change who are currently being disrupted by droughts, flooding, and severe weather are the countries least responsible for causing climate change. I.e. historically, they have very low carbon emissions. Moya de Feita from Belgium said, I believe in poetry as a resistance to climate fatigue, as a healing, connecting and moving antidote to violence and division. And Anj Chavla from India says, I think poetry has always been the language of revolution and has inspired generations to come forward and participate to bring change. And his comments put him very much in line with the Percy Bysshe Shelley lines quoted earlier, and with other reformer poets like Pablo Neruda and Maya Angelou, who believed in the power of poetry to incite change. This is a sketch by Henny Beaumont, who, amongst other things, is a political cartoonist for The Guardian. Henny creates all Poets for the Planet's artwork, and the sketch shows Poets for the Planet performing our Earth Song event at the Great Exhibition Road Festival in South Kensington. The event was free and was fully booked, but turnout was relatively poor and obviously affected by the pandemic, and there was no media coverage. We performed Earth Song again in the Green Zone at COP26 on the 1st of November last year. This time we received a bit of media coverage, including a rather dismissive article by the Daily Mail, whose subheading read, Poets for the Planet, Militant Thunbergians, Why the Queen Really is Better Off Staying Home Rather Than Going to Glasgow for COP26. Here's one of the poems we featured at Earth Song. It's in Spanish and is by Santiago Acosta, who is a Venezuelan poet living in the USA.
Casi no quedaba nadie en la ciudad pesquera. Los reportes advertían que las provincias de la costa no estaban preparadas para ser invadidas por una especie extranjera. Se había intentado todo para controlar la población de gaviotas patiamarillas, cazarlas con halcones, ahuyentarlas con ultrasonido, untar los huevos con aceite para sofocar a los polluelos. Nada había sido suficiente. Hoy han colonizado incluso la capital, donde pueden ser vistas en los basureros escarbando junto a zamuros, vagabundos y recolectores. Cuando vuelan sobre la costa de noche, iluminadas desde abajo por las luces de los hoteles, parecen trozos de papel descartado lanzados al viento. Si me encontrara con alguna de ellas enredada en un amasijo de nylon, con el ala cubierta de anzuelos, el salvavidas seguramente me prohibiría liberarla. Pero esa tarde apareció en la playa una mujer que mantuvo protegida a la joven gaviota mientras yo regresaba con un alicate. El veloz pico mordiéndonos una y otra vez, la carne desgarrándose, haciéndose de arena. Un pescador grababa todo desde su lancha con un celular. Intentamos pedirle ayuda, pero en lugar de voz teníamos un graznido discordante. Esa misma noche, a pesar de las alarmas que sonaban por los altavoces públicos, decidimos quedarnos en la ciudad tomada. Éramos una sombra sobrevolando el agua, nuestros dedos como plumas disolviéndose en la corriente, cuerpos deshechos y expectantes buscando habitar una zona impura, lejos de nosotros.
Oh, that's lovely.
One of the things highlighted during the Earth Song Q&As at COP26 was how poetry communicates the science in a way you can think and feel. This connection with emotion is particularly important if the philosopher David Hume was right and reason is the slave of the passions, i.e. if our feelings are our underlying motivators. Both our Earth Song performances are available to view on YouTube. The Earth Song poems were also used by a few other cultural organisations to help build awareness of the climate crisis. So they featured in the National Theatre of Scotland's Dear Planet programme and in Atmos magazine, and the live performers were radio interviewed by Soundcamp Arts Collective. Outside the COP26 conference, there were some huge protest marches. I saw some performance art by XR, but I didn't see any poetry on the streets of Glasgow. But Climate Fringe organised a nightly open mic at Adelaide Place Baptist Church where eco-poets could perform, and Letters to the Earth organised an event which featured poetry. This was poetry for the purpose of solidarity and morale raising, I think, as the audiences were mainly composed of activists. What more can poets do to reach a wider audience? Well, one thing is to continue to build relationships with partner organisations. So this year, Poets for the Planet compiled eco-poems and a song playlist for Atmos magazine as part of Atmos's Valentine's Day Earth celebration. And we also contributed filmed poems to the Rivers Trust's online spring conference. This event discussed river science, finance, regulation, and data monitoring. And the poems, which were interspersed throughout the day, helped to break up and refresh the conference, I thought. Poets can also consider focusing the messaging of their creative work so that it targets a wider audience, in particular those who refuse to acknowledge or act on the environmental crisis. Climate Outreach is an organisation which specialises in climate communication. It has divided the public into 7 segments with names like disengaged battlers, disengaged traditionalists, and loyal nationals, and it has researched which ideas about the climate crisis are likely to resonate with or antagonise each segment. Including an awareness of this research in our poetry might help our poems land on a wider audience. A good example of this might be The Great Realization by Tomfoolery. This was a poem that went viral during lockdown. I think some of the success of the poem was due to the fact it conveyed messages which Climate Outreach's research shows land well with most segments. So quite a wide audience responds sympathetically to the idea of a world out of balance and corporations that are too large, too powerful, and too unaccountable. And you find both those themes in Tomfoolery's poem, where he talks about a world of waste and wonder, of poverty and plenty, and companies that swelled and got much bigger than we ever could have planned. So how can poetry support activism? Just to sum it up, it can be morale raising, awareness raising, fundraising, a form of deep attention. It can help us imagine new futures. It can be communication enhancing. It can help make us resistant to climate fatigue. It's the language of revolution. It speaks to both head and heart. And I think it can be attitude changing. In particular, I think it can change this attitude we have that the world exists just to service our needs by enhancing our empathy, so we see the world as precious in itself. If you want to find out more about Poets for the Planet, please check out the website where you can pledge with us, and where there's also an excellent guide created by Alexandra Citron on how to run your own poemathon. And feel free to connect with Poets for the Planet and me on social media at Poets for the Planet and at Ian J. McLachlan. And I don't know if there are any questions now, or otherwise we can wait till the end.
Thank you so much for that talk. It was really good. I really appreciated you including the poems as well. It was very nice to, you know, see what people have actually done and how, you know, it can impact the change. So does anyone have a question for Ian at the moment?
Hi, I have a question.
Hello.
Hi, I don't know if that was, you know, perfect timing because I'm from Venezuela and you put that poem.
Oh,
yeah, the thing is that I have this concern about how can you deal sometimes with identity, because what could happen, you know, it's like you could show like something that is happening in a place, and at least that poem was really into nature. And how can you maybe how can you take people that are not from there to a place to maybe to understand what could be happening in just a small area? I don't know, like what kind of how can poetry can relate not just the people from the place, but more people from abroad?
yeah, I mean, when we did our COP26 event, we had poets from all around the world, and so one poet, we had Poeta who did a poem from Brazil, and talked about what was going on in Brazil, and it was all quite specific to Brazil, and about what the people thought about climate change, and there was the angle about what the politicians, how they'd sold things, and yet all of that seemed quite. So I and our audiences didn't have any problem connecting with that. So I think that we are. I mean, we as increasingly as we see stuff on the news, we are aware of what's happening globally, and I think we are. Potentially, I feel quite ready to connect with different. So we had another poet from Hong Kong, and wherever it is. I mean, the basics are the same. I mean, the fact of the depletion of nature and whether or not people are acting or not acting in response to climate change, and the fundamentals of the pollution that's going on everywhere. And so wherever it is, I think that there is enough in common that people can recognize what's going on and see, okay, not quite the same stuff is happening in the UK as happening in Brazil, but it's pretty similar. And you know, in terms of talking about forests being cut down, well, we've already cut down most of our, you know, huge amounts of our forests. So I think there's quite a lot of just natural connection.
Thank you.
Cool.
For that, are there any more questions? I think you can just for now consider what you want to ask. You can also just put it down on in the chat, and then we will come back to them at the end of Katherine's talk. Yeah. So our next guest, hi, is Katherine Gammel, and she is the Marine Conservation and Society Scotland, Marine Conservation Society Scotland Conservation Officer. Yes. And her work.
A bit of a mouthful, don't worry.
yeah, it's a very long sentence. Her work covers many different projects, from education and public engagement to, you know, campaigns and policy. And she will talk more about that now.
Thank you so much, Lillian. Thank you so much for coming along. And I really enjoyed your talk. There was a lot of nodding along and agreeing what you were saying there. Lily's asked me just to come along to speak about my role at the charity and how we've worked with creatives. I've worked with the charity for coming up to 7 years now, but I come from a public engagement and science communication background. So I've always been extremely passionate about communicating the science, communicating the message out to everybody, and recognizing that we need it's spoken about and told about by lots of different people in different ways to ensure as many people as possible understand what's happening to our ocean, what action we can take to protect it. And in the spirit of the Dear Politicians event as well, what our governments can do, what our big industry can do as well, which obviously very linked to our governments and our politicians, to ensure they're playing their part to protect, restore and celebrate our amazing ocean and the blue planet that we all live upon. My role at the Marine Conservation Society is linked to policy, so mostly around marine litter and our clean seas work. So I work very often with politicians, with civil servants, parliamentarians, policymakers, these people who are trying to get new legislation and new laws put through. And I'm trying to do my best to make sure that they've got the evidence that they need to pass that legislation, but inevitably, we need the advocacy to go alongside it, which is the campaigning. And some of the best campaigns I've been involved in is when we've worked with some fantastic creatives, including poets, to get that message across and tell the story. For me, I very much truly believe that people will only take action, protect what they love. And for a lot of people, falling in love is very much driven by a creative output or being in that place as well. So you'll see a few examples. I'm not hopefully going to talk actually too much at you, but be more than happy to answer questions, because at the base of it, every charity works with creatives to get our communication messages out there. So rather than me try and tell you in a nutshell what we do as a charity, I thought I'd share one of our videos where we obviously had to work with filmmakers and we had to work with celebrities to get voiceovers and people who work on imagery to try and put across our message in a nutshell. So hopefully I can take you to the coast right now and tell you a little bit about us as the Marine Conservation Society.
In the UK, you are never more than 70 miles from the coast. Our seas, our beautiful seas, support so much life. They're just as rich and beautiful as anywhere in the world. But they need looking after. Whose job is it to protect them? Yours? Mine? It's everyone's. But we've taken it on with a passion. In fact, we've been the voice for our seas for over 30 years. So what have we achieved so far? Our research is an essential part of the fight to save our seas. We clean miles and miles of coastline and record what we find. Our data helps drive change. We've made it easy to choose sustainable seafood. Fish suppers can be guilt-free. Most importantly, we influence policy and law to protect beneath the waves. We love connecting people with the sea, and we need your help to guard our seas for the future. We are the Marine Conservation Society. Join us, because with your support, we can do even more.
So hopefully everyone's had a nice little trip to the ocean and has come back. And it is very much about, we do need to connect people to the ocean if they're going to take action to protect it. And I think one of the amazing things that we've done over the years is when we have worked with creatives to really connect people to the ocean, no matter where they are. So I'm just going to give you some examples of the different artists and creators we've worked with over the years, and then afterwards more than happy to answer questions more about the policy work that we do or ideas. And obviously a lot of the things that Ian talked about there might hopefully be seen from the other side when charities like ours have been able to partner with creatives and come up with ideas, because now more than ever, we need to give the ocean a voice. The ocean can't vote in Parliament, the ocean can't start a petition, the ocean can't protest. It needs us to do it on its behalf. And anything we can do to inspire people to be that voice for the ocean, we need to do right now. So obviously with this being an eco-poetry event, I definitely had to talk about Susan Richardson, who was our writer in residence just when I first started at the Marine Conservation Society. She came to do the residential with us as part of our 30 species appeal. So again, like Ian said, there were so many amazing outcomes from this. One was to support a fundraising appeal where she wrote a poem about each of the 30 species that we were trying to raise awareness of, but trying to increase donations for people to help protect these amazing species. This photo is actually from an event that we ran in Edinburgh with her, and that is Stuart, our life-size inflatable leatherback turtle, just behind a copy of her book. And that was brilliant about just raising awareness about the fantastic wildlife that we have. But through her poetry, Susan was fantastically able to show the impacts that humanity was having on our oceans and on particular species as well. So it's got a very welcome space on my bookshelf. And if you've not read Susan's work, I'd highly encourage you to have a look. And it's amazing that there's that direct link between a charity and a poet doing that residency and helping with that fundraising appeal. But her words, her poems, we use them very regularly. We're part of a campaign by Scottish Environment Link, which is like an umbrella organisation for NGOs, and they run the Nature Champions project in the Scottish Parliament, where different MSPs, members of the Scottish Parliament, adopt basically a species to champion while they're in Parliament, and that's partnered with a charity. So we've got about 5 or 6 nature champions at the Marine Conservation Society, including one for the leatherback turtles. We were able to share Susan's poems with him to help raise awareness, to get motions put in Parliament, to ask parliamentary questions when we're looking at marine protected areas, or, as you know, turtles are very sensitive to pollution and the impact of plastics as well. So there's amazing ways that we can link together, and it's a different way about telling the story, getting the awareness, and that will be different for different people. But I definitely had to start off with Words the Turtle Taught Me by Susan. Another artist I've done a lot of work with is Julia Barton. So this is now going to like the visual art side and how we've been able to link artwork and sculpture into our policy and parliamentary work. So the top photo is me with Julia, and this is her having created one of her litter cubes, where she was working with us on beach cleans across Scotland, not only collecting the data that I then used to respond to consultations and to write parliamentary briefings, but also to create sculptures and artwork to raise awareness with MSPs directly. So this is a cube of single-use plastic cotton bud sticks, and sadly we see a lot of these turning up around Scotland. So as well as using the data as evidence, we use these sculptures to speak to MSPs. The bottom picture is actually a parliamentary event. So this is in Holyrood itself with Julia, with the MSP sponsoring it, Joan McAlpine, and my manager, Callum Duncan, where we had a brilliant turnout of MSPs because they were interested to see the visual art side of it. They'd read our reports, they knew that plastic was a problem on beaches, but this was a completely new angle for them. Julia brought in a projector into one of the committee rooms to project different images and art onto the walls. She had her different cubes so people could have that tactile, they could feel it and see it rather than just reading a report. And what's a fantastic policy outcome on the cotton buds is I'm delighted to say that in 2019, the Scottish Government passed a law to ban single-use cotton buds in Scotland. And I think Julia's work was a really important part of the journey we got with that policy success as well. And I think what's really important is, I'm a big fan, especially when I'm encouraging young people into marine conservation. You don't have to be a scientist or marine biologist to work in marine conservation. Any path can take you to help be a voice for our ocean. And I think Julia's work here, supporting our citizen science work on the beach, all the way to in Parliament itself, with that brilliant legislative outcome, is a brilliant story to tell, to encourage others to do the same. So now going on to amazing movement and dance. So we run a project called our Ocean Ambassador Network, where we work with different celebrities to help raise awareness of the ocean and the work that we do at the Marine Conservation Society. So we work with dancer Fernando Montano, who's an incredible human being, absolutely lovely to work with. And he actually used, his network to be able to create concerts and content around a dance for the sea sea, to tell the story of what's happening to our sea through dance. So again, instead of me talking, hopefully I'll be able to show this video to give you a little sample of his work supporting us. So again, it's another way to give the ocean a voice. It was a new audience, people who obviously followed Fernando on Instagram, who were really interested in his dance, suddenly got exposed to all this marine conservation messaging that they might have not been exposed to before. And that led him on to do things like a 24-hour dance. You were talking about the poemathons, Ian. He did a 24-hour dance on Instagram where he was continually dancing for 24 hours to raise money for us as well. So pulling in that fundraising part of it, as well as that awareness raising. And to finish off, I'm just going to talk about some more of the audio side of things. So as well as obviously the spoken word, also the importance of music. And we actually did have a hashtag for COP26, which was listen to the ocean. And it's this whole idea that the ocean seems to be a bit of a forgotten ally in the fight against climate change. It plays such an important role. So as well as talking about the impact we're having on the ocean, we really wanted to give the ocean a voice so it could say to the politicians and the world leader at COP, if you recover the oceans, if you protect them, they will be a massive ally in the fight against climate change going forward. So when I was thinking about that messaging, I really wanted to tell you about Steve Burnett, who is a violin maker from just outside Edinburgh. In the picture is me and musician Thorin Ferguson with the Ilmari violin, which is Gaelic for a voice of and for the sea. And it's actually made of a piece of driftwood that Stephen had found washed up on the beach in East Lothian. The neck of the violin then came from the mountains in Italy to tell that source to sea story. And the Ilmari violin has now played in Scottish Parliament. It also played at the International Conference on Marine Litter that was run by the Scottish Government and opened by the First Minister. And I remember actually being in a photo shoot with the then Cabinet Secretary for the Environment, Rosanna Cunningham, and the first violinist of the Scottish Symphony Orchestra with the Ilmari violin. So again, for years, we've been trying to get these politicians to listen to the impacts of what we're doing to the environment, what we can do to help. And again, it was a creative, it was something exciting and new. At the heart, politicians are still human. Some of them make it a bit hard to believe, I do know that, but they're still going to have passions the same as all of us. And if you can find what their passion is it music? Is it dance? Is it poetry? What is it? And try and get them involved in why the ocean matters and how can we tell that story to encourage them to do the same. And just a little bit of a fun thing to finish on. We know that our creatives are incredibly good at being on the pulse of what is happening around the world. And Ian, you talked about poems going viral in lockdown. I think many of you might have heard the sea shanty craze on TikTok that really kind of took off around the world. So that kind of struck a chord with many of us at MCS. And we decided to get a little bit creative ourselves to put some words to one of the famous sea shanties that was going around. So I'm going to leave it there to show you that all of us at MCS, although a lot of us are involved in science or policy making, which can sound quite technical and quite dry, at our hearts, I think we want to be creative. We want to help get the message out there. We want to help give the ocean a voice. And this was the best we could do, which will probably, hopefully you'll enjoy it, but you'll maybe see why we need a little bit of help.
1, 2, 3.
There once was a whale who lived at sea, who loved their home and family, cresting waves the deep dark blue, swimming wild and free. But too soon the humans came with overfishing and climate change. Too soon the humans came and put them in a cage. Plastics washing up on the shore, entangling whales and seals and more. The ocean started warming up, humans to push their luck. But once more the humans came to mend their ways and up their game. Once more the humans came to save our ocean blue. Now is the time to act, to save our seas from more attacks. Stand up and raise your voice, it's time we make our choice. Now's not the time to wait. Listen to the whale before too late. Stand up and raise your voice. It's time to make your choice.
So thank you so much, Lily, for inviting me along today. I watched the first webinar, which is absolutely fantastic and so inspiring, and I'm more than happy to answer any questions or discuss anything that came up in the presentation today.
Thank you so much for sharing all the different art forms that you talked about. I think it was interesting to see what each art form can do and what, you know, artists did you kind of not incorporate, that sounds really bad, but you know, did you connect it and actually, you know, achieved something, as you said, during the beach cleaning and, you know, creating arts from the trash that they actually found on the beaches, which was very interesting. I see some questions here, but if someone has a mic and wants to ask question first for Katherine.
I have a question for Katherine. So thank you so much. That was a really, really nice talk. I really enjoyed it. From your experience working with different artists, would you say that there's like an art form that politicians respond to the best? For example, like, I don't know, art forms that are shareable on social media. You mentioned TikTok, for example, that are more accessible maybe, because I would guess that poetry might not be as accessible for many people than, I don't know, a TikTok video, for example. So would you say that there's like certain forms that work best with politicians?
It's a really good question. And I think it's, again, you know, we've obviously got over 150 MSPs in Holyrood. And again, they'll all have different things that will interest them. But actually, before lockdown, probably one of the most successful parliamentary events I went to was run by Scottish Environment Link around Earth Day, and it was an environmental poetry event, and it had the most MSPs attending. And sometimes it's just, if we can then make it as accessible as possible, that there was then a bit of a fun Twitter challenge to ask the MSPs to write a tweet that basically was a tiny piece of poetry about a bit of nature that meant something to them, and it went down really well, and we had loads of other people getting involved. I do think any kind of art form, when it then can get connected to a policy issue, is going to go down really well with politicians. If there is something they can share, that is always the best thing. They love a photo op, they love an infographic they can share, a video they can be part of as well. But I think, yeah, there's no reason why poetry. I follow, actually, quite, have to admit, I just uninstalled TikTok, so I was spending way too much time on it. But I did follow some amazing poets on there as well, who are obviously reading their work out on TikTok, and we're getting a really good following. I think it's probably finding the right platform, and for MSPs, Twitter is definitely the social platform that they use the most, and that you can tag them in. And then I think hopefully as we come out of lockdown and Parliament will start hosting events again, there'll be so much opportunity then, I think, for artists to get back involved, get in touch with environmental charities, and then see what events they're running. And I think, as Ian said, with the Rivers Trust conference, the fact that you had poems throughout the day, I think that's the kind of thing we need to be seeing more in the environmental sector. When these conferences are being run, or these workshops or cross-party groups, we need to have a little bit of art and a little bit of love in there to remind everyone, this is why we're doing it. This is why we're trying to wrangle out this piece of policy. It's because at the heart of it, we're trying to protect something that we love. So I don't think I could choose if there is one. It might just be the platform, as you say, Katrina, how we then get it out to them. And Twitter's definitely the one for politicians, I would say.
I was wondering, Ian, if you would like to take this question as well, you know, from the perspective of actual poet, and, you know, you're working with Poets for the Planet. So I think it would be interesting to see, what do you think about it, and where do you think that eco-poetry actually fits? Because I feel like poetry has a big platform and a big impact on people. So
yeah, I mean, what we were, when we did our COP26 thing, we were keen to include a mix of different kinds of poets, so that we wanted some slam poets, some performance poets, and then we've got some poets that are kind of more traditional page poets, and then we had poets that specialized in kind of personal performance and had more of a theatrical background. So there are different kinds of poet for different kinds of audiences, and particularly younger audiences, I think, appreciate kind of slam poets and performance poets more. And then, I mean, we've tried to get out the poems in terms of on social media, on all kinds of platforms. We had a bit of problems with Twitter when I was posting on the Poets for the Planet Twitter account. Twitter kept blocking the videos. But poetry videos can be successful. I mean, our beginner fresh videos were achieving, you know, up to 2,000 views. And you know, Instagram, TikTok, we've got a TikTok channel, and I mean, all of the channels can work. Poetry, different kinds of poetry can appeal to different kinds of audiences, and it can be effective if you include things like music, as in the Venezuelan poetry video I showed, and with imagery. You know, you can it doesn't just have to be a talking head. You know, you can make it a filmic experience, and that way I think you can reach quite a lot of different kinds of audience.
Yep, thank you. Any more questions? Okay, I think we have a question here in the chat. I'll read it out. Thank you so much for an insightful session. I currently reside in India. Will be moving to the UK later this year to pursue eminent environment, culture and communication at the University of Glasgow. My question is for both Ian and Katherine. How can eco-poets find their voice in a professional setting? Say if they are also working in sustainability, communication / marketing at environmental organizations or others? Which is a really interesting question. Thank you for asking that.
Do you want me to go first on that one?
Yeah, just go for it.
I think, I mean, the Rivers Trust was the first kind of organisation that approached us and said we're looking to include poets at a kind of a scientific conference. But I mean, I'm hoping that more organisations will do something similar, and we've already seen about with the oceans that is happening elsewhere already. But I mean, I think if you're both a poet yourself and you're working in a professional setting, I mean, start by, if you're in a position, commission some, you know, get poets in yourself. I mean, you can be the instigating force that says, okay, we're running a conference, or we're going to run a social media campaign. Why not, rather than just running with the science, why don't we mix it up a bit and have some art in there as well, to get some. So I mean, I think, you know, you can be a leader on that, and you can be the one that instigates it. And include examples of our own work, you know, to show that to whoever your employer is, and say, look, this is the kind of thing you can use.
Definitely, I agree. And that was one of the main things I was speaking to our marketing team just before this, actually. And with being a charity ourselves, it's then sometimes really hard for us to find the funding to commission art, and we never obviously want to expect them to, can't work for free. Everybody needs to be paid. So if you're going to be within an organization, to be able to seek funding or to seek joint funding with a charity, so that's where we've been able to do that with other creatives, where they're like, there's this fund we can apply for, can we do a joint funding application? And that's when that really comes together as well. So if you're able to highlight that, a lot of people will think that's a great idea and expect that potentially creatives will do the work for nothing. I think it's really important to make sure that everyone understands the value, and it's an equal partnership. So if you're able in that professional setting to highlight the value that it'll bring to the organization, and then be able to seek and support that kind of joint funding application, that usually is the most successful route. It has been very rare, sadly, that a creative's approached us to say, we've got money, can we do this with you? Apart from example, you know, Fernando, who's obviously a very well-established creative, who obviously has his own income and is able to offer that from that celebrity point of view. So I think that would be my my main thing. And don't be afraid to share with colleagues what your passions are and what you're doing outside of maybe what your official job title is. It was when I was doing that sea shanty that I discovered that several of my colleagues were extremely good singers, and had never come forward before, and others who could do, you know, music and things like that. So I think it's, what's really nice is getting to know your colleagues and realizing there's skills and stuff that they'll have that might not have gone on the CV or the application process for the job, but will actually bring a lot to the organization as well. So hopefully that helps, and good luck.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Katherine and Ian. I mean, those are great starting points, at least. Currently, I do work as a marketing manager in an organization. So what I have tried to do is kind of start a conversation around how we can, you know, bring forward the eco-poets from the organization, because not many know that there are people who are interested to put forth their writings. So say some people can really be interested in showcasing their work in annual magazines. So absolutely. So that is where I have started, and hence the question. So and I look forward to be in the UK and see where that takes me.
Thank you so much. Thank you for your question. I feel also like if you are going to be student again, you have big environments to explore within the university as well. I'm running this project actually through, you know, climate innovation grants that I applied for. They liked my idea about this whole project, and they kind of accepted me for the grant. So there's also this way, you know, to always seek for some projects that you can run yourself or join other societies and other practices as well.
Absolutely. I look forward to do that. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Do we have any more questions? I see one in the chat here. It's for you, Ian. In the previous Dear Politicians webinar, Andrew Macmillan said that art and poetry are not substitutes for legislative change, but it makes us pay attention. How do you think poetry might make politicians pay attention? Hence, Dear Politicians.
Yeah, I mean, when we ran our first Verse Aid event, we did invite a number of politicians to attend, and so that's the first way. I mean, alert politicians to the fact that you're running an event, and particularly if you can look for politicians that might already be sympathetic to environmental causes. So I went to a talk given by Zach Goldsmith, and I invited him on a personal level to attend our Verse Aid event, which he expressed an interest in doing, but unfortunately he then lost his seat and he kind of dropped out of communications with me. The first thing is to contact them. I mean, all MPs, you know, you can be contacted, can be emailed, invite them to events. You can send them links to, you know, if poems are online, say this is important to me, you know, include it. I'm concerned about the environment. I saw this poem and it moved me. Perhaps it will move you as well, kind of thing. Just draw their attention to it.
Thank you for that. I was wondering if there are no other questions, if you can just both, you know, finish this off on positive note and maybe just say, how do you think we progressed in, you know, incorporating arts in policy makings, or, you know, talking about climate change from more artistic point of view rather than scientific? If you can just, yeah.
Do you want me to go first this time, Ian? You took the baton last time, and I'll hand over to you. I think for me, and I think Mike's question kind of put my brain into that space as well, is going back to that, you know, the ocean can't write to their MSP, the ocean can't go protest outside Parliament. That's the same for nature and the planet as a whole. So if you, through your eco-poetry, you know, if you can link up with environmental organizations who are doing that policy work, who are doing that advocacy work, to make those connections. So for example, over the last couple of months, I've been responding to a lot of consultations and trying to empower other people on how they can respond to consultations. Because a lot of the time, governance process is difficult. They say they're public consultations, but they are not public friendly. They are complicated things to try and respond to, but these are the key bits of consultation that government will they have to look at to ensure that they're hearing the public's voice. And the last thing I think I would share is just remember that MSPs work for you. Their whole job is to be a voice for their constituency, the people who live there. If they don't hear from you, they're not going to be speaking on your behalf. So if something matters to you, whether it's the ocean, whether it's nature, whether it's planning, whether it's climate justice, everything, if you don't tell your politicians that, whether it's through eco-poetry, whether it's through attending a surgery or writing to them or tweeting them, they're not then going to take that into Parliament, into the chamber, and put pressure on the government to make those changes. So however you want to give the ocean a voice and make that voice heard, it's amazing whatever you can do, because sadly, the ocean can't speak up for itself. So any way you can do it will be amazing.
Yeah, totally agree with that. I mean, I think that, particularly, I think the work of groups like Extinction Rebellion and Greta Thunberg have really put the environment on the map. It should have been on the map. I mean, goodness knows how long these COPs have been running for, but the public is aware. And I think that scientists are increasingly aware of the need to communicate the climate message. And that's something that maybe hasn't been focused on enough, scientists were producing the science, they were producing the reports. It's not enough just to do that. You then have to communicate that to the public and create a social mandate for change. And that, I think that is something that that people who are concerned about the environment are starting to understand, and they are starting to acknowledge that artists of all kinds can be helpful in that communication process. And so I think it's a very positive thing that you're starting to see things like, you've got, Catherine's charity, you've got the Rivers Trusts, they've got the science or they've got the research, and they are looking for artists to help them communicate that message and as Katherine said, and communicate the love of those things and bring the love, make people understand that the love is in themselves for these things. And so I hope that kind of close communication is going to continue, but it feels like it's moving in the right direction now.
Thank you so much for both of you. That was amazing talk, and I feel like many people now finally understood at least why art is important in fighting towards climate justice. So thank you so much for joining us for the call.